Now, I'm going to switch mics, excuse me. I want to introduce our technology futurist. So, we use the term technology futurist to describe modern visionaries who have the depth and breadth to critically examine technology trends and identify alternative and/or more powerful applications for their use. Joining us from now up north is Colin Clark, the lead software architect at OCAD University Inclusive Design Research Center, led by our good friend and colleague, Yuta Treverius. In their work highlighted today, they have reconceptualized the foundations of machine learning and turned them upside down to ensure inclusion of populations of people on the edge, like people with cognitive disabilities. So with that, I'll introduce Colin.
Thank you, Shay. So when I first saw that I was billed as a technology futurist for this talk, I have to admit I was a little worried. I thought, is that me? Is that what I am? How can I presume to speak for a future? And which future is it? Who's welcome in this future? It seems to me technology is often so obsessed with the future, and there are so many aspects of technology's past that are easily forgotten in our rush to the future. I love to dream of the future, of different futures, but part of that means I'm interested in looking at technology's past, at its apparent failures, its obsolete curiosities, and its dead ends as the source of possible new futures. So, for example, the participatory engagement of workers in the 1970s Utopia project, the Dynabook's vision of personal creative learning, and Logo and Seymour Papert's proprioceptive real-world turtles. In particular, I'm interested in the ways that we can change the game of the future. So change the criteria, change our metrics for success, how we evaluate our success, and to measure the success of new technologies not by how much money they make, or how popular they are, or how familiar they seem to us when we first sit down and use them, but to measure it based on their value to our communities and their support for diversity and for creativity. So I've been thinking about this metaphor of forecasting, the conference's theme this year, forecasting the future, and weather really does seem like an apt connection to make with technology. I think it was a brilliant title and theme because they're both best understood as complex and adaptive systems. I'm a sailor, and over the last 10 years or so of sailing, I've tried to learn as much about the weather as I can. Weather, just like our future, isn't something you can expect to master or to control. It's something you have to be sensitive to attune yourself to it. Its patterns, its possibilities, and once in a while, its startling unpredictability. With time and sensitivity, you can learn to hear and feel the weather locally, close to you. When I sail, I can hear the waves lapping on the hull of my boat. I can see the wind approaching on the water as cat's paws, or the clouds building up in the sky, and to be able to read what the changes might be coming. Weather is different everywhere, and local knowledge is essential for navigating it safely. But weather also exists at the same time, and this is kind of weird, at the global level. There, the prevailing trends and interrelated systems are always in motion, and our local actions have global systemic consequences. So too with technology. As creators of technology, as I am, we need to be aware of our impacts on the climate of technology, our impacts on other people's lives and communities, which may be very different from our own. Technology, as Ursula Franklin defined it so simply and so clearly, really, is a practice. Technology is how we do things around here. This is to say, and perhaps I'm pointing at the obvious here, that the ways in which we create our technologies, the techniques and the values and the social dynamics that we actually practice with, we make them with, and invest within them will have fundamentally shaping effects on what the kinds of technologies are that we create and on what people will end up being able to do and to express with them. So many of today's extractive innovations, I feel, are being formed from a kind of myopia that stems from our design culture, how we think about product and development and creating new things. One which assumes that there's often a norm, that there's a typical or an average user. And in the end, this typical or this average tends to look and act and have the same needs as the frankly privileged, wealthy, young white men of Silicon Valley. But really, are any of us typical? Anybody here feel like they're a typical person? I've only once had somebody put up their hand. We know from our own experience personally that, and from working closely with people in our communities, that this just isn't the case. None of us, I think, would identify as average or normal or typical. We're all different, we're in motion, we're changing, and we need different things at different times, and we depend on each other in different ways. This, for me, is the promise of a different kind of future for technology's design, one in which that will allow us to refigure disability into something different. Refiguring disability as something that's not just an individual barrier that we face alone or a medical formalism that gets put onto us, a label, but as an opportunity for, participation in a larger context or system, for negotiating the mismatches that we experience at different times in different situations between our needs and the experience that the environment or system offers to us. So we need to measure future technology by its ability to adapt itself to suit our differing needs. This then is the essential challenge for inclusive design, to create the environment and the means to make technologies that are reflective of and adaptive to the full range of human diversity. One of the strategies that we've been exploring for a couple of years now at the Inclusive Design Research Center, where I work, is called co-design. And this means that we strive to design with people rather than just for them. Co-design can sometimes be challenging and uncomfortable for designers. It means as designers we can't always take that distancing role of being the expert, of the person who knows best in the design process. And instead, we ourselves, as creators of technology, have to be participants. We can't just be the managers or the facilitators of a prescribed process. So I find when I'm doing co-design, I always have to remember to ask some questions of the people I'm working with. What role would you like me to play in this process? And how would you like to participate? Design culture today, I fear, is too often steeped in this strange kind of combination of mysticism and condescension. Mysticism because we still often subscribe to that cult of the great visionary. You know the kinds of CEOs I mean, the ones we love to idolize and treat as a kind of stand-in for the whole invisible network of labor, for all the people at a company who inevitably worked together to design a technology. This, to me, is a kind of fascinating neo-romanticism. I look back to that period of art history, and I've got an image here by Caspar David Friedrich, 19th century romantic painter, which to me typifies this sort of neo-romanticism that design is still caught up in, with the great genius who single-handedly channels the power of nature into their work, yet always stands at a distance from it. So too with designers of today who stand off at a distance from their communities, who live with their technologies every day. So design, when it's practiced inclusively, should be understood as primarily a collaborative and participatory effort. On the other hand, I've noticed that most formal design methods that are practiced in industry and often in academia too tend to adopt a certain kind of outmoded anthropological or ethnographic approach without asking questions about it. Like the idea that a design researcher should be and could be objective, an impassive observer of real world practice, and that then the primary role of the design researcher is to expertly synthesize extract, essentialize, and then model the people that they observed into what are called in the design field personas, or fictional characters taken by gathering the stories of different people in the real world together and essentializing them. And this is what design teams tend to do today. So I've been asking myself, what kind of clarity can really be gained by taking many people in motion, in different environments, people with different needs and different perspectives and different stories, and trying to boil them down into a quick fictional snapshot like a persona, which just serves, in fact, to blur away the uniqueness and the difference of all the individuals who comprise this persona. And the image I have here on the slides is an artwork I've been working on, thinking through this issue of how people are always in motion and what happens when we try to combine them together. And you may see some faces coming out of the murk of an otherwise blurry environment. And this, to me, is the risk of our industry design processes that try to lump together, that average and to norm. And in fact, this is what big data and machine learning often does, is to try to find the norm and to exclude the outliers, to clean up the data with all its difference, with all its edge cases and uniqueness. So this kind of design that I'm worried about is, I think, driven by a mistaken belief, as Alan Cooper says here, that people don't need and can't be articulate advocates for themselves and their communities. And Alan Cooper is a designer who has a very formalized industrial design process that he often tries to remind us is the right process. And Cooper, in one of his articles, says, I quote, "There is a large and growing body of evidence that users don't know what they want, don't know what the medium is capable of, and are quite incapable of imagining something new, useful, desirable, or innovative. What's more, there is ample evidence, though he doesn't give us the ample evidence, that users are entirely ignorant of their inabilities." So, yet when you look around this room and you think of the people we may work with every day, people with disabilities in particular, along with their families and their caregivers, are singularly aware of the barriers and the mismatches that they face every day with today's technologies. And they're often profoundly ingenious and creative with coming up with workarounds and hacks that allow them to make do with what they've got, with technologies that were designed for the mythical, the typical user. The future of design, as I see it, must make room for the creativity of the people who use it and who make themselves at home in our technologies every day. As Elizabeth Sanders points out here, everyone can be a creative contributor to the design process if they want to be and if they're allowed to be. She says, all people have something to offer to the design process. They can be both creative and articulate when given appropriate tools with which to express themselves. So it takes some new and different ways of doing things. We have to listen and reflect on the stories of people who will use our technology and of those who may be at risk of being excluded from their use. In a project we've just started called the Social Justice Repair Kit, we're creating storytelling tools for the web in which people can tell their stories in their own way and in their own languages through written or spoken words, pictures, or videos. Different modes of expression and of reception are built in right from the beginning, along with the scaffolds and supports like text-to-speech, simplification, larger and easier to read text, that help people with learning disabilities and differences engage more easily with other stories and storytellers in their communities. I'd love to show you this, but we're still in the early stages of designing and co-designing with a group of youth activists from Colombia, Rwanda, and Canada's north, conceptualizing these tools jointly. So I see storytelling in general and the creation of living story archives as part of the design process, compiled by users themselves in their own voices, as being an essential component to an inclusive design future, and an excellent alternative to this traditional design hierarchies of expert and traditional abstracting or essentializing models of things like personas and scenarios and other things. Another way that we've been thinking about in terms of how to effectively engage people in the design process is through play and improvisation. We actually work with them to make things and build things. This picture here shows a create-a-thon event where a group of users and designers were brought together to create marble runs. So maybe you've seen these kids' toys where you've got these plastic building blocks, a bit like Lego, that fit together, and you can make these kind of roller coasters or skateboard parks for the marbles to run through and do interesting things. And we did this as a way of reflecting on some work we were doing with a group here in Boulder called FET, and I think Emily Moore is giving a breakout talk about some of that work later, where we wanted to draw out some new tactile and spatial metaphors for a software-based physics simulations. We wanted to bring together teachers and students and people with visual impairments and designers, and then have them do things physically and then reflect on that in terms of describing what they did to their colleagues and the people in their groups, to draw what they did and to think about how they'd interact with those in the two-dimensional space of a screen simulation. And I'll talk more about some of those co-design activities later at my breakout session. Another really important aspect of the co-design in my mind is community. I think it's important to situate design research and practice in the context of our communities, especially those in which the participants have an opportunity to continue to be involved in the process, rather than a focus group or a market research which brings someone in, pulls out, extracts their feedback, and then off you go in your separate lab or your design studio, but rather to create communities where people can continue to be involved throughout the design process and then feel a sense of autonomy or stewardship over the work as it evolves. Fluid is an open source community that Jutta Treviranus and I started back in 2007 and has evolved into a community to support the engagement of what you might call the outliers of the open source world, the people who might not feel that they traditionally would belong or be welcomed in the kind of technocratic environment that most open source software development communities would be. So over the years, Fluid has developed or attracted designers and developers and artists and people with disabilities and users, people who want to invent new ways to design collaboratively and new software frameworks to support what I call material systems or continued design. So imagine if you could take a piece of software off the shelf and freely change it or redesign it to suit your needs or those of friends and family, and to do it without needing to be an expert software developer with access to the source code of the software, because that often doesn't happen. Imagine that when you find a software user interface to be too complicated, like it overwhelms you by showing too much information, too much stuff on one screen, and you think, well, if I could just hide away all this stuff that's getting in my way right now, I could focus and I could simplify it. So imagine that you could just move things out of the way and simplify. Or imagine that any piece of software, and it's still amazing that this isn't the case today, that any piece of software could read words out loud to you and highlight those words and make the words really big so they're easier to read, but without having to deal with all the conflicts and incompatibilities that plagues today's bolt-on after-the-fact assistive technologies. The keyboard shortcuts don't work. This version doesn't work with that other version of a different program, these kinds of things. And imagine being able to share those little customizations and adaptations that work so well for you or others in your community and share them with the people you care for, say for your elderly parents and their friends. My favorite metaphor for this idea of material software that you, after it's been shipped and designed and delivered, can still modify and change and redesign, is the knitting practice of Amy Twigger Holroyd, which she calls reknitting. And in this picture, I've got an example of Amy's work where she's taken a machine-manufactured sweater. So this was a mass-produced sweater that she bought at a thrift store and was able to then take the sweater and, using her reknitting techniques, cut it open and splice in and pick up her own stitches, and to be able to add her own new features and embellishments and really amazing aesthetic personalization. So she's knitted in a new cuff for the sleeve. She's turned a regular sweater into a cardigan. She's added pockets, and all of these are kind of bringing new life into a sweater that otherwise was mass-produced, never designed to be changed or modified, and she's made it her own. And in turn, the owner of Amy's reknitted cardigan could go ahead and make his or her own changes and modifications too. But software doesn't really work like that today. It's brittle, and once it's been released and shipped by a designer, it often no longer has the capacity for change, or only the kind of change that the designers expected, which if we're thinking about people who have very different needs, the outliers, the people on the margins, they may never have bothered or thought it was financially worthwhile to create the customization built right in. And this is often due at the technical level to the way that we write software, the programming languages and the frameworks that have become the norm in the industry today. And programmers who have tight deadlines and hard requirements don't like to hear this, but the reality is that this is going to take time. We need completely different programming languages and tools in order to support this kind of materiality, this ability to change a piece of software after it's been shipped and delivered. Within the Fluid community, we've been experimenting with some software development tools that aim to support a kind of materiality through writing code as data, which makes it more amenable to being changed and customized and remixed on the fly. But there's a lot of research and work that still needs to be done. So summing up, since I think I'm nearly out of time, technology, like the weather, is complex and it's hard to forecast. But it's also something that's clearly influenced by our local activities and our practices. If we dream of a future in which software doesn't perpetuate the precarity and exclusion of many of the most unique, most creative, most experienced and wise members of our societies, then we need to envision and to enact, to actually practice, as Ursula Franklin reminds us, a more reciprocal design and technological approach. We need to find ways to co-design with others who aren't so much like us and to create opportunities for more material and more convivial technologies. Thank you very much.